So you want to eat like a king. You are picturing it already. A roaring fire, a long oak table sagging under golden platters, whole roasted swans arranged with their feathers pinned back on for presentation, goblets of deep red wine, and a satisfied monarch tearing into a drumstick with the confidence of a man who has never once been handed a bill. It is a gorgeous image, and roughly half of it is a lie your brain assembled from movie sets and Renaissance fair menus. The medieval king's table was real. It was extraordinary, and it was nothing like the fantasy. A single royal feast could cost more than a skilled carpenter would earn in a decade. The head cook ran a kitchen staff larger than most modern restaurants, and was paid less than the man who tasted the food for poison. The spices on that table had traveled further than most human beings would move in a lifetime, through more tax borders than a modern shipping container, and arrived at a price per ounce that would make saffron traders today quietly sit down. Tonight, we are pulling back every layer of the king's table: the food, the fraud, the ceremony, the economics, and the secrets that never made it into the paintings. Before we settle in, like and subscribe if you enjoy these, and drop a comment letting me know where you are tuning in from tonight. I always love seeing where these stories end up. Now, dim the lights. Switch on a fan for that soft background hum. Get yourself comfortable and let your shoulders finally drop away from your ears. Tonight is a long one, so just settle in, let the screen do its thing, and we will take it from here. Why was white bread a luxury that marked you as wealthy, while the poor were accidentally eating the healthier option? What happened to the leftovers from a feast that could feed 300, and why was the answer both generous and deeply calculated? Did medieval kings actually eat with their hands? And if so, why were the rules about it stricter than anything you have ever encountered at a formal dinner? How did a dried flower stigma from Persia end up worth more than silver by the time it reached an English kitchen? Why did rich people deliberately destroy their own teeth and consider it a sign of success? What was the one seat at the table that could end a political career before dessert arrived? Was the king's wine actually good, or was it the medieval equivalent of ordering the most expensive bottle at a restaurant and pretending to enjoy it? Welcome to the medieval Great Hall. The fire is loud, the smoke is thick, the bread is white, and somewhere behind a door you cannot see, a man who will never sit at this table is building a sugar sculpture that will be eaten in 4 minutes and forgotten by morning. But that door is where the real story starts. Step through it. The heat hits you first. Not warmth, not the comfortable glow of a fireplace in a living room. This is a wall of heat pouring off open flames large enough to roast an entire ox, and the air around them shimmers the way a road does in high summer. The ceiling is black, not dark, black, coated in years of grease and smoke that nobody will ever scrub away because nobody here considers it a problem. The floor is stone, slicked with fat and water, and whatever else has been spilled during 18 hours of continuous cooking. You are standing in the royal kitchen, and it is not one room. It is a complex of rooms, each one dedicated to a single function, each one louder than you expected. Over to your left is the roasting house. A boy, maybe 10 years old, is turning a spit that weighs more than he does. He has been doing this in shifts since before dawn, sleeping on a pallet beside the hearth when his rotation ends, and he will do it again tomorrow. He is not paid in money. He is paid in food and a place to sleep near the fire, which in winter is not nothing. Behind him, 3 more spits are turning, each one carrying a different animal, each one requiring a different speed of rotation because different meats cook at different rates. The boy knows this. Nobody taught him from a book. He learned it the way every child in this kitchen learned it, by being shouted at until he got it right. In the next room, the boiling house, enormous cauldrons sit over fires that are never allowed to go out. Stocks simmer endlessly. Pottages, the thick stews that will feed the lower tables, bubble away in quantities that seem almost industrial. A woman is stirring one of them with a wooden paddle nearly as tall as she is, and the smell, coming off the surface, is not what you expect. It is rich, it is layered. There is something sweet under the savor, something that smells like cloves, and something else that might be ginger. And you begin to realize that the idea of medieval food as boiled gray sadness is a fantasy invented by people who never read a recipe from this period. Further in, past the boiling house, is the pastry room. Here, the work is quieter, and the temperature slightly lower, and the men working here are the closest thing this kitchen has to artists. They are building pies, with crusts, engineered to stand upright, like architecture. Not because the crust will be eaten, but because the crust is a container, a serving vessel, a piece of structural engineering designed to hold its shape on a table for hours while looking impressive. A modern Michelin kitchen would recognize the technique. They would also recognize the attitude, the quiet, focused intensity of people who are building something beautiful that will be destroyed before the evening is over. This entire operation reports to one man, the master cook. He holds a titled position in the royal household. He is literate enough to manage accounts, skilled enough to coordinate hundreds of dishes arriving at a precise sequence of times, and experienced enough to know the dietary requirements of every senior member of the court by memory. He is, by any modern standard, running a logistics operation comparable to a large restaurant group. His salary, when you convert it, works out to roughly what a mid-level tradesman might earn. The steward of the household, who manages none of the cooking and eats the results of it without comment, earns several times more. The people who do the most physically demanding, technically complex, creatively exhausting work in the building are paid the least. This is not a bug in the system. This is the system, and it is enormous. Under Edward IV, the kitchen household numbered over 200 people. Scullions, spitboys, sauce makers, bakers, pastry cooks, butchers, poulterers, brewers, and the men who did nothing but haul firewood from the stores to the hearths all day, every day, because this kitchen consumes fuel the way a small factory does. The records tell us that thousands of loads of wood were burned through in a single year. Imagine the forest that had to die so the king could eat. Then imagine the people who cut it, carried it, and stacked it, whose names appear in no record at all. The modern version of this is the kitchen brigade system invented by Auguste Escoffier, the one that every professional restaurant kitchen in the world still uses. Stations, hierarchy, chain of command, precise division of labor. Escoffier gets the credit. He deserves some of it. But if you walked him into this medieval kitchen and told him to run it, he would recognize everything except the technology. The structure was already here, 500 years before he was born, solving the same problem he solved. How do you feed hundreds of people, at the same time, at an acceptable standard, without the operation collapsing into chaos? The answer, it turns out, is the same in every century. You build a hierarchy, you assign stations, and you shout, "Now, follow the food out of the kitchen, follow it down the corridor, past the screen's passage, and watch it arrive at the table." But before you look at the roasted swan, the gilded pies, the towering sugar sculptures, designed to make visiting ambassadors quietly reconsider their own kingdoms, look down. Look at the simplest thing on the table, the bread. You would think bread is just bread, something so basic it barely deserves attention. You would be wrong. Bread at the medieval king's table is one of the most precisely calibrated status signals in the entire building, and the system that governs it tells you more about how this world works than any crown or throne ever could. The bread in front of you, if you are sitting near the king, is white. Not the white of modern sliced bread, which is a different process entirely, but a fine, pale, soft loaf called manchette. It is made from wheat flour that has been bolted, meaning sifted through progressively finer cloths, multiple times, until every speck of bran and germ has been removed. This takes time. It takes labor. It takes wheat of a quality that most farmers grow, but cannot afford to keep. The result is a loaf that is light, tender, slightly sweet, and extraordinarily expensive relative to ordinary bread. A single manchette loaf could cost several times what a loaf of coarse maslin bread cost, the brown bread made from a rough mix of wheat and rye that the lower tables ate. And here is the twist. The brown bread was better for you. The whole grain, the bran, the germ, all the bits that the wealthy paid extra to have removed, those were the parts that carried the fiber, the vitamins, the minerals. The poor were eating the nutritionally superior product. The rich were eating the one that looked better, felt softer in the mouth, and signaled to every person in the hall that the person eating it could afford to throw away the most nutritious part of the grain. Nobody knew this at the time. Nutrition science was roughly 700 years away from existing. But the pattern is there, and it is one of the first real status flips at the king's table. The healthier bread went to the people who could not choose, and the beautiful, refined, nutritionally hollow bread went to the people who could. If you look further down the table, past the salt, the bread changes. The manchette disappears. In its place sits a coarser, darker loaf. Further still, at the very end of the hall, where the lowest-ranking members of the household eat, the bread is heavier, denser, sometimes mixed with barley or rye, or whatever grain was cheapest at market that week. You can read the hierarchy of the entire room without looking at a single face. Just follow the color of the bread from one end of the table to the other. White at the top, brown at the bottom. The gradient tells the story. And then there is the trencher. This is the part that catches most people off guard. Before plates were common, you ate your food off a thick slab of stale bread, usually several days old, cut flat and placed in front of you like a plate. Your meat, your sauce, your pottage sat on top of it. The bread absorbed the juices, the fats, the drippings of whatever you were eating. By the end of the meal, your trencher was a soggy, flavor-soaked slab of used bread that had served its purpose. What happened to it next was not accidental. It was political. In a wealthy household, the used trenchers were collected by the almoner, the household officer responsible for charitable distribution. They were gathered, placed in baskets, and given to the poor who waited outside the gates. This was called the dole, and it was one of the most visible acts of Christian charity a lord or king could perform. Everyone saw the baskets go out. Everyone knew the poor were being fed with the remnants of the rich man's table. The Lord looked generous. The church approved. The system worked. Except the system was cheaper than it looked. The trencher bread was stale to begin with. It had already served its purpose. It could not be stored, could not be resold, and could not be eaten by the household in any dignified fashion. Giving it away cost the Lord almost nothing, and bought him a reputation for generosity that would have cost a fortune to build any other way. A modern food blogger would photograph the dole baskets going out and call it a sustainable, zero-waste dining philosophy. It was that, technically, but the sustainability was a byproduct. The motive was reputation, and the cost was nearly zero. In some households, the trenchers did not go to the poor at all. They went to the dogs. The choice was revealing. Feeding the poor with your used bread was piety. Feeding the dogs with it was indifference. Both options disposed of the same surplus. Only the audience changed. You are 2 courses into the king's dinner, and you have not yet tasted the meat, but you have already learned something about how this table works. Everything on it, from the color of the bread to the destination of the scraps, is a calculated performance. Nothing is wasted without purpose, and nothing is given without return. And if the bread is telling you this much, wait until you hear what the spices have to say. The spices have a long story, longer than you think. Because the pepper sitting in a locked chest beside this kitchen did not come from down the road. It came from the other side of the world, and by the time it reached this table, it had passed through more hands, more borders, and more markups than almost any other object in the medieval economy. Start at the beginning. A pepper vine growing on the Malabar coast of southern India, in heat and humidity that would make an English summer feel like a cool afternoon. A farmer picks the peppercorns by hand, dries them in the sun on mats of woven palm, and sells them to a local merchant for a price that, converted to English money, would barely register. A few pennies worth of dried berries. That is where the price starts. It does not stay there for long. The local merchant sells to a larger trader who moves the pepper by boat along the coast or overland to a port city. Each transfer adds a margin. The pepper reaches an Arab trading house, where it is bundled with cinnamon, cloves, and whatever else is moving that season, loaded onto a dhow, and shipped across the Indian Ocean on monsoon winds that determine the entire schedule of the trade. Miss the monsoon, and you wait 6 months. The Arab merchants controlled the middle passage of the spice trade for centuries, and they charged accordingly. By the time the pepper reaches the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf, the price has already multiplied several times over, and the peppercorns have not changed at all. They are the same dried berries. Only the number attached to them is different. From there, the pepper moves to Egypt or the Levant, where it enters the sphere of the Venetian and Genoese merchants who dominated the Mediterranean spice trade. Venice, in particular, built an empire on standing between the source and the customer. The Venetians bought spices in Alexandria, loaded them onto galleys manned by crews who earned less per year than the cargo was worth per pound, and shipped them back to Venice, where the goods were stored in dedicated warehouses, taxed by the Republic, and resold at margins that made Venice one of the wealthiest cities on earth. They were not growing anything. They were not inventing anything. They were standing in the right doorway and charging rent, and the rent was extraordinary. The pepper leaves Venice and travels north, overland through the Alpine passes, or by sea through the Strait of Gibraltar to the ports of northern Europe. It passes through the hands of German merchants at the great trade fairs, Flemish middlemen in Bruges, and finally English importers at the docks of London or Southampton. Each stage adds transport costs, road tolls, harbor fees, customs duties, and another merchant's profit. By the time a pound of pepper reaches the royal kitchen in England, it has crossed more than a dozen tax jurisdictions, been handled by more than a dozen different merchants, and been marked up at every single one of them. The peppercorns themselves weigh exactly what they weighed when the farmer picked them. Everything else about them has changed. Convert the final price into something you can feel. A skilled carpenter in 14th century England earned roughly 5 or 6 pence a day. A pound of pepper could cost anywhere from 1 to 2 shillings, depending on the decade and the supply conditions. At the low end, that is 12 pence, which is 2 to 3 full days of a carpenter's labor for a single pound of dried berries. At the high end, closer to 4 or 5 days. For saffron, the numbers leave the realm of reasonable and enter something closer to absurdity. A pound of saffron, which is the dried stigma of a crocus flower and requires tens of thousands of individual flowers to produce, could cost as much as a pound of gold in some periods. An entire working horse could be purchased for the price of a modest quantity of saffron. The spice sitting in a clay pot in the kitchen was worth more than the animal standing in the stable outside, and the man who finally uses it, the cook, grinding saffron threads into a mortar to turn a dish a brilliant, unmistakable gold, has no concept of the distance it traveled. He has never been to India. He has never seen Venice. He has never met an Arab trader, or a Venetian merchant, or a Genoese shipmaster. He knows that the saffron arrives in a locked chest, that the clerk of the spicery dispenses it by weight with the careful attention of a man handling money, and that wasting even a small amount is the kind of mistake that follows you for the rest of your career. The entire journey, the thousands of miles, the dozens of hands, the centuries of trade infrastructure that made it possible, all of it is invisible by the time the spice hits the mortar. The cook sees a powder. The powder contains an empire, and that locked chest deserves a closer look. The spicery was not a shelf in the kitchen. It was a separate, secured room with a door that locked, managed by a dedicated officer called the clerk of the spicery, who kept meticulous records of every grain dispensed. He weighed spices on a balance. He recorded each disbursement in a ledger. He reported not to the cook, but to the household steward, because spices were too valuable to be left to the discretion of the people who actually used them. Every pinch was authorized in advance, weighed at the moment of dispensing, and reconciled against the ledger at the end of the week. If the numbers did not match, someone had a problem. The system was closer to pharmaceutical dispensing than to anything resembling a modern kitchen pantry. You did not open the spice cabinet when you felt like it. You submitted a request. The range of spices inside that room would surprise most people who assume medieval cooking was a bleak and flavorless exercise in survival. Pepper was the staple, the everyday luxury. Ginger appeared in everything from meat sauces to sweet confections. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and mace were used in combinations that strike the modern palate as unusual, but were deeply considered. Saffron was as much a coloring agent as a flavor, turning dishes a vivid gold that announced wealth before the first bite was taken. But the roster went further. Galangale, a root related to ginger with a sharper, more citrus edge, was enormously popular in medieval English cooking and has now almost completely vanished from Western kitchens. Grains of paradise, a West African spice with a warm, peppery bite and a faint floral finish, was traded across Europe for centuries and is today almost unknown outside specialist food circles. Cubebs, a tailed pepper from Java with a slightly bitter, aromatic quality. Long pepper, which the Romans had loved and the medieval English inherited, hotter than black pepper and with a more complex, lingering warmth. The cooks, building flavor profiles with these ingredients, were not guessing. They were layering heat, sweetness, acid, and floral warmth in combinations that were deliberate and sophisticated. A modern food blogger would describe the results as bold fusion cooking and photograph the dishes in soft light for an audience that would never realize the technique was 700 years old. The vocabulary did not exist. The Instagram account did not exist. But the instinct, the pleasure in building a flavor that surprises and then satisfies, was identical to anything happening in a professional kitchen today. But the spices were never only about flavor, and this is where the display economy of the king's table becomes clearest. Saffron turned food golden, and that golden color told every person in the hall that the host could afford to dye his dinner with a substance more expensive than most metals. Cinnamon was simultaneously a seasoning, a medicine prescribed by physicians for ailments of the heart and blood, and a visible marker of purchasing power. Using spices generously was the medieval equivalent of wearing a brand you are paying for the name rather than the product. The flavor was real. The cooks genuinely cared about it, but the display was the message that traveled furthest. The guest sitting at the lower table, eating pottage, seasoned with nothing but salt and perhaps a little mustard, could smell the cinnamon wafting off the dishes at the high table. He did not need to taste it to understand exactly what it meant. Now follow that smell out of the spicery, past the pantry and the stores, and step outside into the cold air. Because the meat on the king's table did not come from a market. It came from a forest, and the forest was anything but free. The royal forest in medieval England was not what the word suggests to a modern ear. It was not necessarily a dense canopy of ancient trees, though it could include woodlands. It was a legal territory, a defined area of land, subject to a separate body of law called forest law, and that law existed for one overwhelming purpose: to protect the king's right to hunt. Under William the Conqueror and his Norman successors, royal forests expanded until they covered as much as a third of England. Everything within those boundaries, the deer, the boar, the hare, the game birds, belonged to the king. Not to the farmers who worked the land inside the forest, not to the local lords who held estates within its borders, to the king alone, and the penalties for taking what belonged to him were not gentle suggestions. Under William himself, poaching a royal deer could cost you your eyes. His sons and successors eventually softened the punishments to fines and imprisonment, which sounds like mercy until you learn what those fines actually meant for the people paying them. A peasant caught taking a deer could face a fine equivalent to months or even years of his total income. He could lose his right to work his land. He could be imprisoned until the fine was paid, which for many people meant imprisonment without a realistic end. And the deer, meanwhile, roamed freely into his fields and ate his crops, and he could do absolutely nothing about it. The animal that was destroying his harvest had more legal protection than the man whose family depended on that harvest surviving. This was not considered a paradox. It was not considered an injustice. It was considered Tuesday. Venison, then, was never simply meat. It was jurisdiction made edible. When a roasted haunch of venison arrived at the king's table, glistening and fragrant and carved with ceremonial precision, it was not just dinner. It was proof that the king controlled the land, the law, and every living creature within his forests. When the king chose to gift venison to a favored nobleman, he was not being generous with a cut of meat. He was performing a demonstration of power, offering something that only he had the legal right to take, and showing that his favor determined who shared in it. The nobleman who received it ate with gratitude, and with the quiet understanding that the gift was a leash as much as a reward. The hunt itself was an elaborate, expensive operation that served as both royal sport and supply chain. A major hunt required beaters to drive game toward the hunting party, dogs bred and maintained at considerable expense, specifically for the chase, horses trained for forest riding, weapons, and a retinue of attendants to manage the logistics before, during, and after the kill. The butchery of a deer followed its own set of rituals and vocabulary. Specific cuts went to specific people in a prescribed order. The hounds received their portion, laid out on a bed of the deer's own hide. The huntsman claimed certain organs as his traditional right. Even the act of dismembering a dead animal was a hierarchy, with every piece assigned before the first knife touched the carcass. Convert the annual cost of maintaining a single royal hunting operation into labor, and the numbers resist easy comprehension. The dogs alone required a dedicated kennel staff, regular feeding, and permanent housing. The horses required stabling, skilled farriers, and year-round feed. The forest itself required wardens to patrol it, verderers to administer its courts, and an entire judicial apparatus to investigate and punish violations of the forest law. A carpenter earning 5 pence a day would need to work for years to cover the annual operating cost of a single royal forest. And there were dozens of forests scattered across England, each one a small legal kingdom within the larger kingdom, each one burning money so the king could eat venison and call it sport. The farmer living inside the forest boundary, watching the king's deer chew through his barley, while the law forbade him from lifting a hand against them, worked every day of his life and could not afford the meat that was destroying his livelihood. The king, who had never planted a row of anything, ate that same meat with spices that had traveled 6,000 miles, off bread so white it glowed in the firelight, at a table where even the seating arrangement could end a man's career. That is the king's table so far. And we have not yet talked about the fish. The fish. Because for roughly half the year, the king's table could not serve meat at all. Not because the supply ran out. Not because the deer were scarce or the kitchen was short-staffed. Because the church said no. The medieval calendar was governed by fasting rules that were not suggestions, not guidelines, and not optional. Not even for kings. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were fast days. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, was a fast. Advent, the weeks before Christmas, was a fast. Ember days, the vigils before major saints' feasts, and various other holy periods scattered unevenly across the calendar were all fasts. Add them together, and you arrive at a number that most modern people find genuinely difficult to believe. Roughly a third to nearly half of the entire year was designated as time when no Christian, from the lowest serf to the king himself, was permitted to eat meat, eggs, or dairy. The rules were serious. The enforcement was social, which in a society where your neighbors watched everything you did and the parish priest kept a long memory, was more effective than any law, and the result was an entire parallel food economy built around a single question that repeated itself hundreds of times a year. If you cannot serve meat, what do you put on the table instead? Fish. Enormous, staggering, almost incomprehensible quantities of fish. The demand created by the fasting calendar was one of the great invisible engines of the medieval economy. Every household in England, from the poorest cottage where a salted herring might be the only protein available to the royal court, where the expectation was magnificence, regardless of the day, needed fish on fast days. The infrastructure required to meet that demand was one of the largest and least romantic industries in the medieval world. Herring fleets sailed the North Sea in numbers that would qualify as a minor naval operation. English, Dutch, and Scandinavian boats worked the same waters in a seasonal frenzy of netting, gutting, and salting that turned entire coastal towns into processing centers. The catches were salted in barrels, packed tight, and shipped across the continent in volumes that made herring one of the most traded commodities in Europe. Wars were fought over herring grounds. Treaties included fishing rights. The humble, silver, oily little fish was, pound for pound, one of the most politically significant animals on the continent, and almost nobody at the king's table would have considered it worth mentioning. Stockfish was the other staple. This was cod, caught in the cold waters off Norway and Iceland, cleaned, and hung in the freezing Scandinavian air to dry without salt until it became a rigid, pale plank of concentrated protein that could last for years without rotting. It was light, it was portable, it was nearly indestructible, and it was one of the most important preserved foods in the medieval world. The taste, after soaking and reconstituting, was not delicate. It was strong, fibrous, and an acquired enthusiasm. But it kept, and in a world where preservation technology was limited to salt, smoke, and cold air, something that kept for years was worth its weight in convenience. Stockfish was imported into England in enormous quantities, and the trade routes that carried it kept entire port towns alive. The people who caught it, dried it, and shipped it earned modest livings. The merchants who controlled the distribution earned considerably more. The fish trade was not glamorous. It smelled terrible on the best of days, the work at sea was dangerous, and the profit margins for the fishermen themselves were thin enough to discourage ambition. But the trade was essential because the church had made it essential, and nobody in medieval Christendom was in a position to argue with the church about what they were allowed to eat for dinner. For the king's table, fast days presented a different kind of challenge entirely. The expectation was not merely to eat fish and endure the restriction with visible piety. The expectation was to eat fish magnificently, to demonstrate that even under the church's dietary rules, the king's table remained the most impressive surface in the country. A royal fast day table could be every bit as elaborate, every bit as expensive, and every bit as theatrical as a meat day table. It was simply built from a different set of ingredients, and the ingenuity required to make that work was considerable. Fresh fish was the first distinction. While the common household ate salted herring and reconstituted stockfish, the royal household ate fresh. Pike, pulled from the estate fish pond that very morning, was a luxury that only the wealthy could manage. The pike is a predatory freshwater fish, large, firm-fleshed, and aggressive, and in medieval England it was considered one of the finest fish available. Salmon was prized and expensive, especially when it came from specific rivers known for quality. Eels were everywhere, served in pies, in stews, in jellies, and in quantities that suggest medieval England had an enthusiasm for eel that the modern palate has almost entirely abandoned. The eel pie was not a curiosity. It was a standard, expected, and apparently beloved feature of the medieval fast day table. prepared in dozens of variations and consumed with a genuine appetite that most modern diners would struggle to share. And then there was lamprey. The lamprey is a jawless, parasitic fish that attaches itself to other fish with a circular, toothed mouth and feeds on their blood. It looks like something designed by a committee tasked with making seafood as unappealing as possible. And it was considered an absolute delicacy, one of the most prized items that could appear on a noble or royal table during a fast. Lamprey pie was a dish of genuine prestige. The city of Gloucester traditionally sent a lamprey pie to the king as a ceremonial gift, a tradition that survived for centuries. King Henry I reportedly died from eating what the chronicles describe as a surfeit of lampreys, which is either a cautionary tale about the dangers of excess or compelling evidence that lamprey was so extraordinarily good that a king could not stop eating it, even when his body was telling him, clearly and urgently, to stop. Given the available options, both interpretations have merit. And then there were the creative classifications, which tell you everything you need to know about the medieval capacity for motivated reasoning when appetite and theology collided. Porpoise was eaten on fast days, so was whale. The logic was that these animals lived in water, and therefore they qualified as fish. The anatomical objections are obvious to a modern observer. They were not entirely lost on medieval scholars either, but the theological argument was constructed with the kind of careful, institutional flexibility that only genuine hunger and genuine power combined could produce. A porpoise lives in the sea. A fish lives in the sea. Therefore, a porpoise is, for the purposes of Lenten compliance, a fish. Nobody was fooled. Everybody was fed. The church maintained the principle of the fast without alienating the powerful households whose support it depended on. The king maintained a table that did not look like sacrifice. The porpoise, presumably, had no strong feelings about its taxonomic reclassification. Maintaining a reliable supply of fresh fish for a royal household was not a simple matter of sending someone to the river with a net. It required dedicated, expensive, permanent infrastructure. Fish ponds, called stew ponds, were a valuable asset on any major estate. They were carefully constructed, sometimes involving significant earthworks, to create the right conditions of depth, flow, and temperature. They were regularly stocked with pike, bream, tench, perch, and other freshwater species. They required ongoing maintenance, management of water flow, control of silting, and periodic restocking from wild sources or from other managed ponds. The cost of building and maintaining a well-stocked fish pond was considerable. A carpenter earning 5 pence a day would need to work for several weeks to cover the annual upkeep of a single pond. Owning one was not just practical convenience. It was a status marker, visible proof that you could afford permanent infrastructure dedicated to ensuring your fast days tasted better than everyone else's. The fish living in your pond had, in some measurable sense, better living conditions than many of the laborers working on the estate that surrounded it. The entire system reveals something about the relationship between religion and appetite in the medieval world that is considerably more interesting than the simple version most people carry around. The fast was real. The restriction was genuine. The spiritual intention behind it, to practice discipline and sacrifice in imitation of Christ's suffering, was sincerely held by many people. But the wealthy found ways to transform restriction into a different kind of display, to make the act of not eating meat into an occasion for spending more money rather than less. A fast day at the king's table was not a day of gray, humble, penitential simplicity. It was a day of elaborate fish cookery, rare and expensive ingredients, and the quiet satisfaction of demonstrating that even your sacrifice looked like a feast. The church told you what you could not eat. It never once told you how much you were allowed to spend on the alternative, and the rich heard that silence clearly. The church controlling what you could eat on specific days of the week is the direct ancestor of every modern diet plan that assigns food categories to calendar days. The compliance anxiety is identical. The guilt when you cheat is identical. The creative interpretation of what technically counts as following the rules is, if anything, less inventive today than it was in the 14th century. Nobody in the modern wellness industry has yet attempted to reclassify a whale as a vegetable, though it is probably only a matter of time. And on the days when meat was permitted, the king's table abandoned restraint entirely and put on a show that would stun a modern observer into genuine silence. You are sitting in the great hall. The first course is arriving, and it is not a single dish. It is a procession. Servants file through the screens passage at the far end of the hall, carrying platters, trays, and covered dishes in a continuous, carefully sequenced stream. The first course alone might contain a dozen or more separate dishes, arranged on the table in a display that prioritizes visual impact as much as access. And there will be 2 or 3 courses after this one, each as large as the first. The sheer volume of food is not a miscalculation, not an error of planning, not someone in the kitchen losing count. It is the point. Abundance is the message. The table is the medium. And every guest in the room is the audience. The meats arrive first. Roasted venison, the gift of the forest, and the edible proof of the king's jurisdiction over the land. Whole roasted boar, presented with its tusks still attached, because presentation matters more than anyone's convenience in carving it. Swan roasted whole, and then painstakingly reassembled with its white feathers pinned back on, so it arrives at the table looking almost alive, its neck curved, its wings arranged, a culinary taxidermy project that required considerable time and served no practical purpose beyond making everyone at the table aware that the host could afford to serve a bird most people would never taste. Peacock received the same treatment, its iridescent tail fanned out behind a body that had been cooked, seasoned, and reconstructed purely for the visual impact of its arrival. Nobody at this table was eating peacock, because peacock was particularly delicious. Peacock is tough. It is dry. It is generally inferior in flavor and texture to a well-roasted chicken, and everyone in the kitchen knew this. But a roasted chicken does not make visiting ambassadors sit slightly straighter in their chairs and quietly reconsider the wealth of the kingdom they are visiting. A reconstructed peacock, with its tail feathers blazing in the firelight, does. The bird was there for the performance. The flavor was optional. Beside the roasted meats sit the pies, and these are not the small, hand-held pastries the word might suggest. A medieval pie could be enormous. The crust was built thick and strong, engineered to stand upright on the table, like a small piece of architecture. This crust, called a coffin, was often not intended to be eaten at all. It was a container, a structural shell made from a dense, heavy paste of flour and water, designed to hold its shape during hours of baking and hours more of sitting on a table being admired. Inside, the fillings could be extraordinarily elaborate. Layers of different meats, dried fruits, spices, eggs, bone marrow, and rich sauces assembled in combinations that required genuine technical skill and considerable time. A single large pie could represent days of coordinated labor from several cooks, and it would be carved open at the table in a moment of small theater that everyone present politely pretended was unremarkable. The pottages arrived alongside, thick and heavily seasoned. Frumenti, a spiced wheat porridge enriched with egg yolks, saffron, and ground almonds, was traditionally served with venison and was considered both a luxury and a marker of a properly furnished table. Blancmange appeared as well, and it bears absolutely no resemblance to the wobbly, sweet, pastel-colored dessert that uses the same name today. Medieval blancmange was a savory dish. It was made from shredded chicken pounded smooth, cooked with rice, ground almonds, sugar, and spices into a pale, rich, creamy mixture that was considered both a delicacy and a restorative food for the sick. Physicians recommended it. Cooks took pride in it. If you told a medieval cook that his blancmange would one day become a children's dessert sold in plastic cups at supermarkets, He would not understand a single word of that sentence, and he would be offended by every implication of it. And then, arriving between the courses, or at the climax of them, came the subtleties. This is where the king's table left the realm of dining and entered something closer to installation art, with a shelf life measured in minutes. A subtlety was a sculpture made from sugar paste, marzipan, and pastry, shaped and painted and gilded to depict castles, ships, biblical scenes, heraldic animals, allegorical tableaux, or whatever subject the host had commissioned for the occasion. They could be enormous. Some stood several feet tall. They were built by specialist confectioners who spent days constructing them, painting them with edible pigments, applying gold leaf to surfaces with the precision of manuscript illuminators, and engineering internal supports to ensure the structure survived the journey from the kitchen to the table without collapsing into an expensive heap of sugar and embarrassment. The subtlety arrived. The hall fell quiet for a moment of collective admiration. A few minutes of appreciation passed, perhaps a speech or a toast connected to the scene the sculpture depicted, and then it was eaten, or broken apart and distributed, or simply cleared away to make room for the next course. Days of skilled labor, ingredients worth more than a laborer's monthly wage, artistic effort and technical ingenuity that would command respect in any century. All of it consumed or discarded in the time it takes to drink a cup of wine. Your carefully plated brunch, photographed from directly above and shared with the internet, is a faint, pale, apologetic echo of what these people were doing to show off 500 years ago. They did it bigger, they did it more expensively, and they did it without the possibility of anyone outside the room ever seeing it. The audience was only ever the people at the table, and that was enough. The dishes were not just seasoned, they were colored. Saffron turned sauces and rice a deep, unmistakable gold that glowed in the firelight. Sandalwood powder tinted dishes a warm red. Parsley juice dyed things green. The visual effect across the table was deliberate, vivid, and startling to anyone expecting the drab, monochrome image that most people carry when they think about medieval food. The king's table was not beige. It was not gray. It was a riot of intentional color, designed to demonstrate that the host had access to dyes and ingredients most people in the room would never use in their own kitchens, and most people outside the room would never see in their lives. Nobody here was chewing sadly on boiled turnips and pretending to enjoy it. That particular fantasy belongs to a very different income bracket. The king's table was excess made edible, politics made visible, and vanity made delicious. Every dish carried a message, and the message was always the same. This is what power tastes like, and you are fortunate to be close enough to smell it. And speaking of how close you are allowed to sit, that depends entirely on one object sitting in the middle of the table, a salt cellar, and its position is about to tell you exactly how much you matter. Look around the room you are sitting in, really look at it, because the great hall of a medieval castle or palace was not designed to be comfortable, it was designed to be seen. Every surface, every dimension, every architectural decision in this room serves one purpose, and that purpose is the performance of power made visible to every person eating inside it. The hall is enormous. The ceiling rises high above you, supported by timber beams blackened by years of smoke from the central hearth or the massive fireplace built into the far wall. The room is longer than it is wide, and the proportions are deliberate. Length creates distance. Distance creates hierarchy. The further you sit from the head of the room, the less you matter. And the architecture makes certain that everyone in the building understands this without anyone needing to say it aloud. At one end, raised on a platform called the dais, sits the king's table. The elevation is not much, a step, sometimes two, but it is enough. From the dais, the king can see every person in the hall, and every person in the hall can see the king. This is not a dining convenience, it is a stage. The raised table is the medieval ancestor of every VIP section in every restaurant and every club in the modern world, and the purpose is identical in both cases. Everyone below can see you. You can survey everyone below. And the elevation communicates, without a single word being spoken, exactly who matters most in this room. Below the dais, long trestle tables fill the body of the hall. They run the length of the room in parallel rows, and they are not permanent. They are assembled before meals and cleared afterward. The boards lifted off their supports and carried away so the hall can serve its other functions as a court, a meeting place, a reception room, and occasionally a dormitory for household members who slept on the floor wrapped in cloaks. The tables are arranged in a strict hierarchy of proximity to the dais. The closer your table is to the king's table, the higher your status. The further away, the lower. At the very back of the hall, near the screen's passage, where the food enters and the cold drafts blow in from the corridor, sit the lowest-ranking members of the household. They eat the same meal, technically, but they eat a diminished version of it, and they eat it in the cold, and they eat it knowing that the architecture of the room is a diagram of their insignificance. The screen's passage itself is worth a moment. This is a partition, usually wooden, that separates the main body of the hall from the corridor leading to the kitchen, the pantry, and the buttery. Servants enter the hall through doorways in the screen, carrying food from the kitchen in a controlled flow. The screen serves a practical purpose, blocking drafts and hiding the working corridor from the view of the diners, but it also creates a boundary between the performance space and the backstage. What happens behind the screen is labor. What happens in front of the screen is spectacle. The food crosses that boundary and is transformed by the crossing, from a thing that was made into a thing that is presented. The lighting in the hall comes from candles, torches mounted in iron brackets along the walls, and the glow of the hearth or fireplace. The effect is dramatic, but not bright. Faces flicker. Shadows move on the walls. The gold leaf on the subtleties catches the light and throws it back in small, warm flashes. The smoke from the fire and the torches drifts upward, but never entirely leaves the room, and after an hour of dining, the air carries a haze that softens everything, blurring the edges of the far tables and the faces of the people sitting at them. The floor beneath your feet is covered in rushes, dried reeds spread across the stone and mixed, if the household is well managed, with herbs like lavender or meadowsweet to mask the smell of whatever has been dropped, spilled, or tracked in since the last time the rushes were changed. The rushes are changed periodically, not as often as you would like. The noise is considerable. Several hundred people eating, drinking, talking, and laughing, in a stone room with no soft furnishings, no carpets, no curtains, and no acoustic treatment of any kind, produces a sound that is closer to a crowded stadium than to a modern dining room. Conversation at any distance requires raising your voice. The clink of knives on trenchers, the scraping of benches on stone, the occasional bark of a dog hoping for scraps under the table, the voices of the servants calling to each other through the screen's passage, all of it combines into a constant, rolling wall of sound that the human ear eventually normalizes but never quite ignores. It is warm, it is human, it is alive, and it is not at all the solemn, candlelit silence that most films use when they depict medieval dining. Into this room, into this noise and smoke and firelight, place a single object on the table, the salt cellar, and watch what it does to everyone around it. The great salt cellar was not a modest shaker. It was an object of deliberate extravagance, made from silver, sometimes from gold, sometimes encrusted with jewels, or decorated with enamel. Some took the form of elaborate architectural structures, miniature towers, or castles standing a foot or more tall. The most prestigious form was the nef, a salt cellar shaped like a ship, with masts and rigging and tiny figures on deck, crafted by goldsmiths with the same care and expense they would give to a reliquary or a royal crown. The nef was placed on the table in front of the king, or the highest-ranking person present, and its position divided the entire hall into two categories of human being. Above the salt meant you were seated between the salt cellar and the king. You ate from the better dishes. You drank the better wine. You were served earlier. You were visible. You were acknowledged, and your presence at that end of the table was a public confirmation of your political relevance. Below the salt meant you were seated on the other side, further from the king, closer to the screen's passage, closer to the drafts, eating lesser food from lesser dishes, and drinking wine that had been watered more generously. The distinction was understood by every person in the room. It was not subtle. It was not ambiguous. It was architecture made personal. A change in your position relative to the salt was not a minor logistical adjustment. It was a public statement about your standing, and it was noticed by everyone. Being moved one seat closer to the king was a political victory that would be discussed by the court for days. Being moved one seat further away was a humiliation that required no explanation, because the explanation was the move itself. Careers were measured in seats. Alliances were visible in proximity. A nobleman who arrived at court, confident of his position, and was directed to sit 2 places further from the salt than he had sat the previous week, understood, in the time it took to walk to his chair, that something had changed, and that the change was not in his favor. Dinner, the most basic human activity, the simple act of sitting down and eating food, was the most politically dangerous hour of a courtier's day. The place you were told to sit communicated your standing more clearly than any title, any proclamation, any written document. You could be stripped of your dignity between the bread and the second course, and the instrument of your destruction was a seating chart. Caring intensely about where you sit, relative to the most powerful person at the table, is a human weakness that has not evolved by a single inch in 700 years. The medieval salt cellar is the direct ancestor of every modern seating chart at every wedding, every corporate dinner, every state banquet, and every restaurant that puts its best table by the window and its worst by the kitchen door. The anxiety is identical in every case. The stakes, in the medieval version, were simply higher. Nobody at a modern wedding reception has ever been imprisoned because they were seated too far from the bride, though the emotional experience of being placed at the back table may occasionally feel comparable. Now, the seating is assigned, the salt cellar is in place, and the food is ready to leave the kitchen, but it does not simply arrive. It is carried, it is guarded, it is presented, it is tested, and it is carved, all according to a ceremony so detailed and so rigid that the act of putting food in front of the king took longer than you would believe possible for a task that a modern waiter accomplishes in 30 seconds. The procession begins behind the screen's passage. Dishes leave the kitchen covered, carried by servants who walk in order, watched by the household marshal or his deputies to ensure that nothing is touched, tasted, or tampered with between the kitchen and the table. The food is guarded during transit because the fear of poisoning was real, constant, and never entirely unfounded. We will return to that fear shortly. For now, understand that the simple act of moving a platter from one room to another was treated with the same security protocol that a modern government might apply to classified documents, except the documents were edible, and the consequences of a breach were measured in corpses rather than scandals. At the table, the food was received by the sewer, the household officer responsible for organizing the sequence and presentation of the courses. The sewer decided which dishes were placed where, in what order they were served, and how the pacing of the meal would proceed. The title sounds humble to a modern ear. The role was not. The sewer was typically a man of gentle birth, sometimes the son of a nobleman, and the position was considered an honor, a mark of proximity to power, and a step on the ladder of courtly advancement. Organizing the king's dinner was not a chore. It was a career. The carving of the meat was performed by another specialist, the carver, who held a titled position that required a specific set of skills and a specific vocabulary that no other trade in the medieval world shared. Each type of animal had its own carving terminology, and using the wrong word was a social error that marked you as poorly educated as surely as wearing the wrong clothes. You did not cut a deer. You broke it. You did not cut a chicken. You sauced it. You unbraced a mallard. You unlaced a coney. You allayed a pheasant. You displayed a crane. You disfigured a peacock, which, given the earlier effort of pinning its feathers back on for presentation, feels like an appropriately dramatic conclusion to the bird's evening. The fact that an entire parallel vocabulary existed solely for the act of taking apart an animal at the dinner table tells you everything about where this society placed its anxieties. Correct language mattered. Correct procedure mattered. Doing the right thing with a knife at the right moment in the right way, using the right word to describe what you were doing, was not a practical concern. It was a social survival skill. The carver worked standing, which was itself a mark of respect. He did not sit at the table and casually pull apart the meat. He stood, often with a towel over one shoulder, and carved with an audience watching. The cuts were prescribed. Specific portions went to specific people in a specific order, beginning always with the king. The choice cuts, the best pieces, went to the highest-ranking diners. The lesser cuts traveled down the table with the hierarchy. By the time the meat reached the far end of the hall, the portions were smaller, the cuts less desirable, and the message was the same one the bread had already delivered and the salt cellar had already confirmed. You are here, at this distance, eating this piece, because that is what you are worth. The cupbearer presented wine and ale with a formal bow, offering the cup to the king after first pouring a small amount and drinking it himself. This was not a toast. This was an assay, a test for poison, conducted in full view of the table. The cupbearer's willingness to drink first was not courage, it was job description. The cup was then presented to the king, who drank, and only after he had finished could the rest of the table be served. The sequence was invariable. The ritual was performed at every meal. The formality never relaxed. Not even on ordinary days when no guests were present and the threat of poisoning was, by any rational measure, minimal. The ceremony existed because the ceremony was the point. The meal was a performance, and every role had its choreography. These positions, the sewer, the carver, the cupbearer, were not held by servants in the way a modern person understands the word. They were held by young men of noble families, placed in the royal household as part of their education, learning the rituals of courtly life by performing them. Serving the king his dinner was a privilege, a mark of favor, and a form of training for future careers in politics, diplomacy, or household management. The boy standing behind the king's chair, ready to refill the cup or pass the towel, was not a waiter hoping for a tip. He was a future baron, learning the grammar of power, one carved pheasant at a time. The entire performance, from the covered dishes leaving the kitchen to the last cup of hippocras served after the final course, could last hours. The food arrived cold more often than you would think. A dish that was piping hot when it left the roasting hearth might pass through the screen's passage, wait while the dishes ahead of it were presented and assayed, wait again while the carver finished with a previous course, and finally reach the table at a temperature that would prompt a complaint in any modern restaurant. Nobody complained. Nobody sent it back. The temperature of the food was secondary to the ceremony of its arrival, and everyone at the table understood this implicitly. The meal was not about eating efficiently, it was about performing correctly. The food was the medium, the message was power, hierarchy, trust, and control, served on a trencher and eaten with 3 fingers. And behind all of this ceremony, behind the carver's vocabulary, and the cupbearer's bow, and the sewer's careful choreography, sits one quiet, persistent, never entirely absent fear, the fear that someone, somewhere in the chain between the kitchen and the king's mouth, has put something in the food that was never meant to be there. The poison taster is waiting, and his job is exactly as terrible as it sounds. But, Before we get to the man whose job it was to die for the king's dinner, let us talk about how you are actually eating this meal, because you do not have a fork. Nobody in this hall has a fork. The fork will not arrive in mainstream English dining for another several hundred years, and when it finally does, people will hate it. You are eating with your hands. A knife and a spoon are available to you, and between those two tools and your fingers, you are expected to manage every dish placed in front of you. This is the part where the modern imagination usually collapses into an image of people tearing meat apart like animals, grease running down their arms, bones tossed over shoulders, a general atmosphere of cheerful barbarism that makes the whole era feel like an especially rowdy barbecue. That image is wrong. It is not just a little wrong. It is almost perfectly inverted from the reality. The rules governing how you ate with your hands at a medieval table were more numerous, more specific, and more strictly enforced than anything most modern people follow at even the most formal dinner they will ever attend. Etiquette manuals from the period survive in surprising detail, and they read like instruction manuals for a social minefield. Wash your hands before the meal, in front of the other diners, using the basin and ewer that a servant carries from guest to guest. This is not a private act of hygiene. It is a public performance of courtesy. Everyone sees you wash. Everyone sees that your hands are clean. The act of washing declares that you respect the people who will eat beside you, and skipping it declares the opposite just as clearly. Use only 3 fingers to pick up food, not your whole hand. 3 fingers. The thumb, the index, and the middle finger held together with a precision that takes practice to make look natural. Take small pieces. Do not grab. Do not reach across another person's portion of the table. Do not put a piece of food into your mouth and then change your mind and put it back on the serving dish, which is a rule that should probably still be written down in modern etiquette guides, but apparently no longer needs to be, because forks have removed the temptation. Do not blow on your food to cool it. Do not pick your teeth at the table. Do not scratch any part of your body while eating. Do not dip bread that you have already bitten into the communal sauce dish. Do not speak with your mouth full. Do not lean your elbows on the table. Do not spit. Do not wipe your hands on the tablecloth, though in practice, this rule was apparently broken often enough that the manuals kept repeating it, which tells you something about the gap between aspiration and reality that exists in every century. The point of all of this was not hygiene, although hygiene was a welcome side effect. The point was legibility. The way you ate told the table who you were. A person who handled food delicately, who kept their fingers clean, who took small portions and chewed with their mouth closed, was advertising their breeding, their education, and their fitness for polite society. A person who grabbed, who chewed loudly, who wiped grease on their sleeve, was advertising the opposite. Table manners were a class detection system, and they worked with brutal efficiency. You could wear fine clothes and sit in a good seat, but if you ate like someone who had never been taught the rules, every person watching would know, within the first course, exactly where you came from. Now, the fork. The fork existed. It had been used in Byzantium for centuries. It was known in Italy, where it appeared on wealthy tables well before it reached Northern Europe. And when it finally made the crossing, the reaction was not gratitude. It was suspicion, mockery, and in some quarters, outright moral condemnation. The most famous version of this story involves a Byzantine princess who married the Doge of Venice in the 11th century and brought forks to the table as part of her dining customs. A Venetian clergyman reportedly denounced the fork as an affront to God, reasoning that God had given human beings perfectly functional fingers, and that refusing to use them to eat was an act of vanity and possibly heresy. The princess died shortly afterward, which the clergyman interpreted as divine judgment on her utensil choices. Whether this story is precisely true in every detail matters less than the fact that it was widely repeated, because it captures something genuine about the European reaction to the fork. The fork was foreign. It was associated with luxury, effeminacy, and the kind of excessive refinement that Northern Europeans liked to attribute to Byzantines, and Italians, while quietly envying both. It was, in every meaningful sense, a culture war fought over a piece of cutlery. A clergyman calling a fork an insult to God's design is the kind of confidence that only genuine ignorance can produce. It is also, if you replace the word fork with any piece of modern technology that older generations initially found threatening, completely recognizable. The fork controversy is the medieval equivalent of every moral panic over a new invention. Suspicion, outrage, theological hand-wringing, and eventual, total, silent adoption once the generation that objected the loudest dies and the next one grows up never knowing the world without it. Replace fork with smartphone, with television, with the printing press, and the pattern is identical every single time. The fork eventually won, of course. It always does. But in the hall you are sitting in tonight, the fork is still centuries away from being socially acceptable, and you are managing your roasted venison with 3 fingers and a knife, and doing it well enough that nobody at the table has yet noticed you were not born in this century. Which is a comfort, because the alternative is being noticed, and at this table, being noticed for the wrong reason is never a small problem. And now, the man who eats before the king eats, the man whose daily working life consists of tasting food that might kill him, smiling to confirm it did not, and doing it all again at the next meal. The credentiarius, the poison taster. His job is exactly as straightforward and exactly as horrifying as the title suggests. Before any dish reaches the king's mouth, the credentiarius takes a portion and eats it. Before any cup reaches the king's lips, the credentiarius drinks from it. He does this at every meal, for every dish, for every cup, in full view of the table, as part of a formal ceremony called the assay. The assay is not optional. It is not reserved for occasions when a specific threat has been identified. It is performed constantly, routinely, at every meal, because the threat of poisoning in a medieval court was not an occasional crisis. It was a permanent atmospheric condition, like weather, and the fear was not irrational. Poisoning was a genuine tool of medieval politics. It was difficult to prove, easy to deny, and effective in ways that assassination by blade or ambush was not. A king who died suddenly, after a meal, left a court full of suspects and a succession crisis that could be shaped by whoever moved fastest. The chronicles are full of suspected poisonings, some confirmed, many merely rumored, and the rumors were as damaging as the reality because they sustained the fear that kept the entire security apparatus of the king's table in operation. The covered dishes, the guarded corridors, the servants' watch during transit, the cupbearers' assay, the credentiarius, tasting every dish, all of it existed because the possibility, however remote on any given evening, was never zero. The countermeasures went beyond tasting. Objects believed to detect or neutralize poison were kept at the table and used with absolute seriousness. The most famous was the unicorn horn, which was in reality the tusk of a narwhal, a spiral of ivory that could grow several feet long and was believed to sweat, change color, or neutralize poison on contact. A unicorn horn was dipped into the king's drink before he drank it, and the absence of a reaction was taken as confirmation of safety. The science behind this was, to put it gently, non-existent. But the objects themselves were fabulously expensive. A single narwhal tusk sold as unicorn horn could cost as much as a substantial house. Convert that price into a carpenter's daily wage of 5 pence, and you arrive at a figure measured not in days or months, but in years of labor, all of it spent on a narwhal tooth that did nothing except provide the emotional comfort of a ritual performed with great confidence and zero effectiveness. Cups made from agate or serpentine were also believed to crack, shatter, or change color in the presence of poison. They did not, but they were expensive, they were beautiful, and the belief persisted because the alternative, accepting that there was no reliable way to detect poison, and that the king's safety at dinner depended entirely on the loyalty of every person who had touched the food, was too uncomfortable to sit with. The technology of poison detection in the medieval world was, in its essential character, identical to every modern wellness product that promises to detect toxins in your body using a crystal or a bracelet. The anxiety is real. The solution is expensive. The efficacy is imaginary. The market is eternal. Spending the equivalent of a house on a narwhal tooth because you believed it could detect poison is the kind of investment decision that no amount of wealth can make intelligent. But the alternative was trusting everyone. And in a medieval court, trust was the most expensive commodity of all and the one in shortest supply. And the credentiarius himself, the man standing beside the table, tasting everything, risking everything, and earning a wage that, when you look at the household accounts, was not remarkable. He was not a nobleman. He was not celebrated. He was not paid a premium that reflected the genuine, daily, physical danger of his work. He was a household servant with a specific, grim function, and his compensation reflected his social status rather than his occupational risk. The person physically closest to the king's food, absorbing the greatest personal danger of anyone in the service chain, was among the least powerful and least rewarded people in the room. The king, who faced the risk, was protected. The credentiarius, who absorbed the risk, was expendable. The system worked for everyone except the person it depended on most. And now let us pour a drink, because after all that ceremony, all that tension, all that elaborate performance of hierarchy and fear, surely the wine at the king's table is extraordinary. Surely the most powerful man in the country is drinking something magnificent. Perhaps, perhaps not. The answer is more complicated and considerably funnier than you expect. Wine was the prestige drink of the medieval English court. It was imported, primarily from Gascony in southwestern France, in enormous quantities. The English crown held Gascon territories for centuries, and the wine trade between Bordeaux and English ports was one of the largest and most profitable commercial relationships in medieval Europe. Ships carried barrels of wine north across the Bay of Biscay and up the English Channel, and the volume was staggering. Edward II's household accounts record thousands of gallons purchased in a single year. Wine was not a rare treat at the royal table. It was a daily expectation, served at every meal, in quantities that suggest a household commitment to drinking that would concern a modern physician. The problem was quality. Gascon wine was made to be drunk young, within a year or so of production. It did not age well. It was not stored in conditions that preserved it. The barrels sat in the holds of ships that pitched through rough seas, then sat in cellars that were not temperature controlled, then sat on tables in halls heated by open fires. By the time the wine reached the king's cup, it could be magnificent, it could be acceptable, or it could be well on its way to vinegar, and the distance between those outcomes depended on variables that nobody could reliably control. When the wine turned, the solution was not to throw it away. The solution was to fix it. Hippocras was spiced wine, sweetened with honey or sugar, and infused with cinnamon, ginger, and other spices, strained through a cloth bag, and served warm or cold. It was considered a luxury. It was served at the end of meals as a digestive and a signal that the feast was reaching its conclusion. And it was, at least some of the time, a rescue operation. A wine that had turned sour or developed an off flavor could be transformed by enough spice and enough sweetness into something that tasted not just drinkable, but desirable. The spices covered the faults. The sugar masked the acid. The result was presented as a delicacy, and nobody, absolutely nobody, was going to stand up at the king's table and announce that the Hippocras tasted like it was hiding something. The cheapest drink was the freshest and often the safest. Ale, brewed on site in the household brewery, consumed within days of production, was the daily drink of nearly everyone in the medieval world, regardless of status. It was thick, it was nourishing, it was mildly alcoholic, and it was reliably fresh, because it did not travel and it did not keep. The alewife or the household brewer made it in batches, and what was brewed this week was drunk this week. There was no transport problem. There was no storage problem. There was no spoilage problem. The cheapest drink in the building was the one that most reliably tasted like what it was supposed to taste like. Buying the expensive drink when the cheap one was better is a tradition as old as ordering bottle service at a club. The instinct to equate cost with quality has never once been consistently reliable. And the medieval wine trade is one of the earliest and most thoroughly documented examples of an entire economy built on the assumption that expensive means good, even when the evidence in your cup is telling you otherwise. Mead, made from fermented honey, occupied a strange and somewhat nostalgic position. It was ancient, it was prestigious, and it was expensive, because honey was expensive. But by the high medieval period, mead was being displaced by wine as the prestige drink of choice, and it appeared more often in poetry and legend than on actual tables. It was the drink of memory, of old stories, of a golden age that may never have existed quite the way the stories described it. The king might drink mead on a ceremonial occasion or as a nod to tradition. He drank wine because wine was what power looked like in the present tense. The wine was watered, incidentally, not for the king, or at least not by much. But, as the service moved down the table, the wine was diluted more and more generously. The guests furthest from the salt drank wine that bore an increasingly theoretical relationship to the original contents of the barrel. It was not entirely water. It was not entirely wine. It was the liquid equivalent of the seating chart, another gradient that told you, without words, exactly how much your presence at this table was worth. You have been eating for hours now. The dishes have come and gone in their careful sequence. The subtleties have been admired and destroyed. The wine has been poured, assayed, and drunk. The candles are burning lower. The fire is still loud, but the room has settled into the steady, heavy warmth of a space that has been full of people and heat and food for a long time. Your body is full. Your mind is drifting, and the conversation around you is beginning to soften, the sharp political edges of the early courses giving way to something warmer and looser as the evening deepens. But there is one more secret the king's table is keeping, and it is hiding in plain sight. In the smiles of the people sitting closest to the king, in the dark, crumbling, rotting teeth of every wealthy person in the room, and in the strange, quiet fact that the poorest people at the back of the hall are the ones with the healthiest mouths. Sugar, the sweetest secret at the king's table, and the one that did the most visible damage. Sugar arrived in medieval Europe through Arab trade routes, carried by the same networks that moved spices, silk, and knowledge across the Mediterranean. In its earliest appearances in English and French records, sugar was not a cooking ingredient, it was a medicine. It was sold by apothecaries, dispensed in carefully measured quantities, and prescribed for ailments ranging from chest complaints to melancholy to disorders of the stomach. The idea that a sweet, pleasant-tasting substance might cure illness was not a hard sell, and physicians recommended it with the confident authority of men who had never conducted a controlled experiment in their lives. Sugar was good for you. The doctors said so. The doctors were wrong, but they would not find out for centuries, and in the meantime, the wealthy ate sugar with the serene confidence of people following medical advice. As supply increased and trade routes matured, sugar began its slow migration from the apothecary's shelf to the kitchen table. It remained expensive, it remained a luxury, but it moved from being a medicine that happened to taste good to being an ingredient that happened to have medical credentials, and that shift changed the way wealthy people ate. Sugar appeared in savory dishes, in sauces, in the spiced wine at the end of the meal, in the blancmange and the frumenti, and the elaborate confections that closed the great feasts. It was the primary building material for the subtleties, those towering sugar paste sculptures that took days to construct and minutes to destroy. And it was consumed, by the wealthy, in quantities that would make a modern dentist physically recoil. The consequences arrived on schedule. Sugar is corrosive to dental enamel. It feeds the bacteria that produce acid in the mouth. It does this reliably, predictably, and without regard for the social standing of the person consuming it. The wealthy, who could afford sugar, ate it constantly. Their teeth decayed. They turned black. They crumbled. They fell out. The process was gradual, but inevitable, and it played out across the faces of the ruling class, with a visibility that made it impossible to miss. And here is the twist that makes the medieval relationship with sugar genuinely strange. Because the damage was visible, because rotting teeth appeared almost exclusively on the faces of people who could afford sugar, rotting teeth became a status marker. Black teeth meant you were wealthy enough to eat the thing that caused them. White teeth meant you were too poor to afford it. The association was not subtle, and in a world where visible markers of wealth were the primary language of social position, the color of your teeth said something about your income that was difficult to fake, except people tried. There are references, scattered and sometimes ambiguous, but persistent across multiple sources, to people of lesser means deliberately blackening their teeth or allowing existing decay to progress without treatment in order to appear wealthier than they were. The idea is grotesque to a modern sensibility, faking tooth rot as a flex. The way someone today might carry an empty designer bag or wear a brand they cannot actually afford, or lease a car that costs more than their monthly income to suggest a lifestyle they are not living. The specific vanity is different. The underlying impulse, the desperate, creative, self-destructive desire to look like you belong to a class you do not belong to, has not changed by a single degree in 700 years. Vanity finds a way. It always finds a way. And when it runs out of positive things to display, it will happily display damage instead, as long as the damage reads as expensive. The poorer you are here, the better your smile. It is the one and only category where being broke is quietly winning. The laborer at the far end of the hall, eating his coarse bread and his unsweetened pottage, has teeth that would photograph beautifully. The nobleman 3 seats from the king, smiling through a mouth that looks like a bombed graveyard, has paid a considerable fortune for the privilege of that destruction. He considers it a sign of distinction. He is not entirely wrong if distinction is measured by how much money you have spent making yourself worse. The medical establishment, meanwhile, continued to recommend sugar for ailments of every description. Wellness culture has not moved on as far as it likes to think. The medieval conviction that sugar was medicinal is the direct ancestor of every modern superfood trend that promises transformative health benefits on the basis of enthusiasm rather than evidence. The acai berry, the activated charcoal, the apple cider vinegar, the turmeric latte, the confidence is identical. The evidence base is comparable. The main difference is that the medieval version had the decency to taste good. Now, the candles are burning lower. The fire is settling into its deep, red, late evening glow. The conversation in the hall has softened, and the sharp edges of the early courses have given way to a warmer, heavier, quieter atmosphere. Your body is full, and your mind is beginning to drift, and the world outside this hall feels very far away. But outside, the season is turning, and the season matters more to this table than anything that has happened inside the hall tonight. Because what the king eats in July and what the king eats in January are not the same meal. They are not even close. Winter changed everything. In a world without refrigeration, without canning, without vacuum sealing, without any of the technologies that modern food systems depend on to move perishable goods across time and distance, the approach of cold weather was not a minor inconvenience. It was a structural transformation of the entire food supply. Fresh meat, fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, fresh dairy, all of it became scarcer, more expensive, or entirely unavailable as the months darkened and the temperature dropped. The king's table in December was a fundamentally different proposition from the king's table in June, and no amount of wealth could entirely close the gap. The solution was preservation. And preservation in the medieval world meant three things: salt, smoke, and cold air. Salt was the most important. Meat was packed in salt, rubbed with salt, submerged in brine, and stored in barrels for months. Fish was salted by the ton. Vegetables could be pickled in salt and vinegar. The technology was ancient, it was effective, and it was expensive, because salt itself was a traded commodity with its own supply chains, its own taxes, and its own politics. In France, the gabelle, the royal tax on salt, was one of the most hated levies in the kingdom and contributed directly to social unrest that simmered for centuries. Salt was not just a seasoning, it was infrastructure. Without it, nothing kept, and without things that kept, nobody ate after October. Smoking was the second line of defense. Fish and some meats were hung in smokehouses, exposed to wood smoke for hours or days, until the surface dried, and the chemicals in the smoke created a partial barrier against decay. Smoked fish, smoked bacon, smoked sausages filled the stores of every household that could afford to build or access a smokehouse. The flavor was strong. It was not always pleasant by the time winter was deep, and the smoked provisions had been sitting in storage for months, but it beat the alternative, which was nothing. The third method was simply cold. Root cellars, underground storage rooms, insulated by earth, maintained temperatures cool enough to slow decay for some foods. In rare cases, the wealthiest households had access to ice, harvested from frozen ponds in winter, and stored in insulated pits packed with straw. Ice storage was a luxury that very few could maintain, and it was not reliable enough to serve as a primary preservation strategy. It was a supplement, a convenience for the richest households, and a curiosity for everyone else. The great event that marked the transition from fresh to preserved was the Martinmas slaughter, which fell around the feast of St. Martin on the 11th of November. This was the point in the agricultural calendar when the decision was made about which animals the household could afford to feed through winter and which would be killed now, before the cost of their upkeep exceeded the value of their meat. The animals that could not be sustained through the cold months were slaughtered in a concentrated burst of butchery that transformed every estate and every village into a processing facility for several frantic, bloody, exhausting days. The scale was considerable. Cattle, pigs, sheep, and poultry were killed, bled, skinned or plucked, butchered, and immediately packed in salt or hung for smoking. The entire household worked. The smell was extraordinary. Blood, offal, salt, smoke, animal fat, cold air, and the sharp, sweet, slightly metallic tang of fresh meat in quantity. Every barrel, every crock, every available container was filled. The work was urgent because meat that was not preserved immediately began to spoil, and spoiled meat in a world without antibiotics was not just unpleasant, it was potentially lethal. The Martinmas slaughter was not a celebration, although it coincided with one. It was a deadline, and missing it meant hunger. As winter deepened, the quality of food on the king's table gradually declined in ways that no amount of money could entirely prevent. The salted meat grew harder, drier, and more aggressively salty as the months passed. The smoked fish, which had been tolerable in November, was becoming an endurance exercise by February. The heavy spicing that characterized medieval cooking was not purely a matter of fashion or display. It was, at least in part, a practical strategy for making preserved food palatable. A sauce loaded with pepper, ginger, cinnamon, and cloves could disguise, or at least compete with, the overwhelming saltiness of meat that had been sitting in brine for 3 months. The spice trade and the preservation problem were linked at a level that most casual histories overlook. The reason the wealthy spent fortunes on pepper was not solely vanity. It was also the fact that pepper made salted beef taste like something other than concentrated regret. The phrase fresh meat meant something in February that it does not mean in a modern supermarket. When the first animals could be slaughtered in spring, when the first green vegetables pushed through the soil, when eggs became available again from hens that had stopped laying during the darkest months. The relief was genuine and physical. Spring was not just a change of weather. It was a change of diet, and the change was felt at every table from the king's to the poorest cottage. A carpenter earning 5 pence a day would need to work for several weeks to cover the cost of enough salt to preserve his family's winter meat supply. The salt alone could consume a significant fraction of a modest household's annual income. The king's household, which needed to preserve provisions for hundreds of people, spent sums on salt that make the spice budget look modest. The medieval anxiety about winter food supply is the direct ancestor of every modern pantry stocking instinct. The scale is different, the technology has changed, but the underlying current of unease, the quiet voice that says you should have more put away, that the shelves are not full enough, that something might run out, that is the same voice that drove the Martinmas slaughter and filled the barrels with salt and brine 700 years ago. The fear has outlived the conditions that created it. It lives on in the back of every modern refrigerator, behind the items you bought for no clear reason, and will probably throw away before you eat them. And speaking of the overlap between the kitchen and anxieties about the body, there is one more layer to the king's table that most people never consider. Because in the medieval world, the line between food and medicine was not a line at all. It was a blur, a smudge, a region of overlap so complete that the cook and the physician were, in many practical situations, working on the same project from different angles. The theory of the 4 humors governed medieval medicine, and it governed medieval eating in ways that reached directly into the kitchen and onto the plate. The body, according to humoral theory, contained 4 essential fluids: blood, which was hot and wet; phlegm, which was cold and wet; yellow bile, which was hot and dry; black bile, which was cold and dry. Health depended on keeping these 4 humors in balance, and illness resulted when one humor became excessive or deficient. The physician's job was to diagnose the imbalance and prescribe a correction, and the correction, as often as not, involved food. Every food was classified according to the same system. Beef was hot and dry. Fish was cold and wet. Pork was cold and moist. Lettuce was cold and moist. Pepper was hot and dry. The physician would assess the patient's humoral constitution, determine which humor was out of balance, and prescribe foods that would correct the imbalance by providing the opposite qualities. A patient suffering from an excess of phlegm, which was cold and wet, would be prescribed foods that were hot and dry: roasted meats, pepper, ginger, warm wine. A patient suffering from an excess of yellow bile, which was hot and dry, would be prescribed foods that were cold and wet: fish, cucumbers, cool water. The logic was internally consistent, carefully reasoned, and supported by centuries of intellectual tradition. It was also completely wrong in every clinically meaningful sense, but that is a distinction that would not be established for several hundred more years, and in the meantime, the system functioned as a comprehensive, socially accepted, and occasionally quite enjoyable framework for telling people what to eat. The royal physician had a genuine role in menu planning. This was not a casual advisory position. The physician's recommendations could determine which dishes were prepared for the king on a given day, based on the physician's assessment of the king's current humoral state. A king who was judged to be suffering from an excess of cold, wet humors might find his menu adjusted to include more roasted meats, more pepper, more ginger, more warm spiced wine. A king who appeared overheated and irritable might find himself eating more fish and fewer spices. The kitchen received these instructions and adjusted accordingly. The meal was simultaneously dinner and a medical intervention, and nobody at the table would have found this arrangement unusual. The medieval physician telling the king what to eat based on a theoretical framework with no clinical evidence is the direct ancestor of every modern wellness influencer recommending foods based on blood types, body types, dosha profiles, or gut instincts. The confidence is identical in both cases. The theoretical architecture is, in both cases, impressively detailed and internally coherent. The evidence base is, in both cases, somewhere between minimal and imaginary. The main difference is that the medieval physician at least had the courtesy to prescribe roasted venison with cinnamon, which, regardless of its humoral properties, was a genuinely pleasant thing to eat. Prescribing a roasted peacock because the patient's humors are too cold and too wet is the kind of medical advice that nobody in any century has ever refused. The overlap between kitchen and pharmacy extended to the spices themselves. Ginger was prescribed for digestion. Cinnamon was prescribed for the heart and the blood. Saffron was prescribed for melancholy, which means that the golden color of the king's dishes was simultaneously a display of wealth, a culinary decision, and a medical treatment for sadness. The fact that the treatment also happened to look magnificent on the table was, presumably, a coincidence that nobody felt compelled to question. The cook, then, was not merely feeding the household. He was, in part, administering a medical regimen designed by a physician whose understanding of the body was built on a theory that classified all of physical reality into 4 categories and attempted to manage human health by adjusting the temperature and moisture content of dinner. The cook did not need to understand the theory. He needed to follow the instructions, and the instructions, whatever their scientific merits, generally resulted in food that was well seasoned, carefully prepared, and pleasant to eat, which is more than can be said for most actual medicine in any century. The night is getting late now. The fire is lower than it was. The hall is quieter. The feast has been cleared and the tables will soon be dismantled and carried away. But there are still a few secrets the king's table is keeping, and they belong to the people you have not yet properly met. The people who built everything you ate tonight and will never sit where you are sitting. The cook. Start with the boy, because they all started as boys, 10 years old, maybe younger, brought to the kitchen by a parent who saw it as an opportunity, which it was, though the opportunity came wrapped in heat, smoke, exhaustion, and the particular indignity of being the lowest creature in a room full of sharp objects and hot surfaces. The spit boy slept near the hearth, on a pallet or a pile of rushes that smelled of grease and ash, and his job was to turn the spit at a constant, even speed for hours at a time. The rhythm mattered. Too fast, and the surface burned, while the center stayed raw. Too slow, and the joint cooked unevenly, and the master cook noticed. And when the master cook noticed something had gone wrong, the correction arrived quickly and without much interest in the feelings of the person who had caused the problem. The boy learned by doing, by watching, by being shouted at, and by absorbing, over months and years, the accumulated knowledge of a kitchen that had been operating in some form for generations. From spit boy to scullion, from scullion to assistant in one of the specialized rooms, the boiling house, the pastry room, the sauce kitchen. Each step upward brought a slightly better position, slightly more responsibility, and a marginal improvement in the quality of the scraps you were allowed to eat. The hierarchy inside the kitchen mirrored the hierarchy of the hall it served, but with less ceremony and more bruises. You advanced by competence, by endurance, and by the slow accumulation of trust from the people above you. There was no academy. There was no apprenticeship certificate. There was work, and then more work, and eventually, after years or decades, the possibility of becoming the person who ran the entire operation. The master cook at the top of this chain was a man of genuine skill. He understood preservation techniques that kept food safe for months. He understood the properties of dozens of spices and how they interacted with different meats, fish, and grains. He understood the dietary requirements of humoral medicine well enough to adjust menus according to the physician's instructions. He understood timing with a precision that would be recognizable in any modern professional kitchen, coordinating dozens of dishes to arrive at the table in the correct sequence, at the correct temperature, with the correct presentation. He managed a staff of over 100 people in a workspace that was dangerous, relentlessly hot, and operating under constant pressure. By any modern standard, he was running a logistics and culinary operation comparable in complexity to a large restaurant group. The Forme of Curie, a recipe collection compiled by the master cooks of Richard II around 1390, survives as evidence of what these men could do. The recipes are sophisticated. They describe dishes that require multiple stages of preparation, precise seasoning, careful temperature management, and a genuine understanding of how ingredients behave under different conditions. The cooks who wrote these recipes, or more likely dictated them to a literate clerk, were not following simple instructions. They were working from a body of professional knowledge that took decades to acquire, passed down through working relationships rather than textbooks, and refined through daily practice in kitchens that never stopped operating. And the master cook's wages, when you find them in the household accounts, are modest. Convert them, and you arrive at a figure comparable to what a competent tradesman might earn, comfortable, not poor, but nothing that reflected the scale of responsibility, the technical skill, or the sheer physical endurance the job required. The steward of the household, who managed administrative affairs and ate the results of the cook's labor without particular comment, earned several times more. A senior clergyman attached to the household, whose daily contribution to the functioning of the estate was a prayer and a blessing, earned more. The chapel was better paid than the kitchen, and the kitchen fed the chapel. The cook created the spectacle that elevated the king's reputation. Every diplomatic feast that impressed a foreign ambassador, every coronation banquet that communicated the wealth of the kingdom, every Saints' Day celebration that reinforced the king's piety and generosity, all of it was built in the kitchen by men whose names almost never appeared in the chronicles, the letters, or the official records of the events they made possible. The king received the political capital. The cook received his wages. The exchange was not equal, and nobody involved expected it to be. His name rarely survived. The Forme of Curie is attributed to the cooks of Richard II as a group. Individual names appear occasionally in household accounts, listed alongside payments for their services, but they appear in the same registers as payments for firewood, candles, and animal feed. The cook was an expense. The meal he produced was an event. The distance between those two categories is the distance between labor and power, and it has not closed appreciably in 700 years. The chef at any restaurant you have ever eaten at is doing the same work, with the same invisibility, for the same disproportion between effort and recognition. The kitchen has always been the room where the most skilled work happens, and the least credit is given. And the food the cook produced was never more important than when it left the country, because the king's table was not just where the king ate. It was where foreign policy was conducted, alliances were displayed, and visiting dignitaries were given a carefully calibrated experience designed to communicate a single, overwhelming message. This kingdom is wealthy, this king is powerful, and you should adjust your calculations accordingly. The diplomatic feast was the most expensive and most consequential meal on the medieval calendar. When a foreign ambassador arrived, when a treaty was being negotiated, when a rival king visited or sent representatives, the table became an instrument of statecraft. The quality of the food, the number of courses, the elaborateness of the subtleties, the quantity of wine, the quality of the entertainment, the gifts distributed during and after the meal, all of it was calibrated to impress. Underperformance was a political humiliation. The ambassador would return home and report that the king's table was modest, that the feast was adequate but not remarkable, and that assessment would travel through the courts of Europe and adjust the diplomatic calculations of every kingdom that heard it. A disappointing feast could cost more in political capital than a lost skirmish. The numbers, when you can find them, resist ordinary comprehension. Richard II's feast in 1397, held in Westminster Hall to celebrate the king's reconciliation with the city of London, reportedly fed 10,000 people over several days. The provisioning for an event of this scale was a military operation in all but name. Thousands of animals were slaughtered. Tons of flour were consumed. Barrels of wine numbered in the hundreds. The kitchen staff worked in shifts around the clock. The cost, spread across the royal accounts, represented a sum that would exceed the annual revenue of a mid-sized noble estate. One dinner, or rather one series of dinners, cost more than many landed families earned in a year. The state dinner has not changed in function since the medieval period. The food is still secondary to the message. The seating is still political. The entertainment is still chosen for its impression rather than its intrinsic merit. And the bill is still paid, ultimately, by people who were not invited. Medieval feasts were funded by taxation and estate income drawn from farmers, laborers, and tenants who would never see the inside of the great hall, let alone taste the food served there. The king's table was paid for by the people who ate at no table, or who ate at tables so far from the salt that the distinction between attending the feast and not attending it was largely theoretical. Spending more than a village earns in a year to convince a foreign king that you are wealthy is a strategy that only works if you are already wealthy enough not to need it. The irony sits quietly at the center of every diplomatic feast ever held, and nobody at the table has ever found it useful to point it out. And while the food arrived and the toasts were made, and the politics hummed beneath the surface of every polite conversation, the hall was not silent. It was never silent, because the feast came with its own soundtrack, its own performers, and its own particular brand of dangerous entertainment. Minstrels were part of the furniture of a great household. Some were employed permanently, living in the household, eating at the lower tables, and performing whenever required. Others were traveling performers, moving from estate to estate, feast to feast, offering their services in exchange for food, lodging, a few coins, and the hope of catching the attention of a patron wealthy enough to offer something more permanent. The permanent minstrels had a modest security. The traveling ones lived on charm, talent, and the willingness to perform for an audience that might be generous, or might be indifferent. And the difference between the two was impossible to predict until you were already playing. The instruments were harp, lute, rebequake, pipe, tabor, and psaltery, among others. The music ranged from solo harp performances of haunting, modal melodies that drifted through the hall like smoke, to larger ensembles for major occasions that filled the stone room with a sound that was rich and resonant in ways that modern concert halls, with their carefully engineered acoustics, deliberately try to replicate. The music during a meal was not background. It was part of the atmosphere, as essential to the experience of the feast as the food or the firelight. A hall without music during dinner felt empty, and a lord who could not provide musicians for his guests was advertising a deficiency that everyone noticed and nobody mentioned directly. Storytellers and reciters appeared as well, performing passages from romances, chivalric tales, and histories that the audience knew well enough to anticipate the favorite moments. The stories were long, episodic, and designed to be consumed in installments across multiple meals, which makes them the medieval equivalent of serialized television, released on a weekly schedule to an audience that gathered at the same time and place to hear the next chapter. The delivery was oral, the audience was communal, and the anticipation between episodes was genuine. The only significant difference is that nobody in the medieval hall could skip ahead to the final episode, which, if you think about it, is an improvement over the modern version. And then there was the jester. The jester held a position in the medieval household that has no precise modern equivalent, because no modern employer would tolerate the job description. The jester was licensed to mock. He could say things that no other person in the household could say without risking punishment. He could comment on the powerful, the vain, and the foolish, with a directness that would end anyone else's career. He could make the king laugh by saying something that would make a courtier weep if a courtier had said it. The license was real, but it was also unwritten, undefined, and enforced by a boundary that nobody had ever formally located. The jester knew he could go far. He never knew exactly how far, and the consequence of misjudging the distance was not a performance review. It was, depending on the king's temperament and the sharpness of the remark, anything from a cold silence to imprisonment. Being paid to be funny within boundaries that nobody wrote down and everybody enforced is the medieval ancestor of every modern comedian navigating what can and cannot be said in front of a corporate audience, a political audience, or any audience where the most powerful person in the room is also the person most likely to be the subject of the joke. The tension is identical. The skill required is identical. The risk has diminished considerably, which is probably why the modern version produces less interesting results. Being paid to make fun of the most powerful person in the room, who has the legal authority to imprison you, who controls whether you eat tomorrow, and who is surrounded by armed men whose loyalty is to him and not to the quality of your material, requires a very specific combination of talent, courage, and fundamentally poor judgment. The great jesters of the medieval period possessed all three in abundance. Some became genuinely influential, their observations carrying a weight that courtiers' opinions did not, because the jester's insights arrived disguised as entertainment, and therefore bypassed the defenses that serious counsel activated. A king who would argue with an advisor might listen to a jester, because laughter opens doors that logic cannot. The performers, all of them, occupied a strange social position. They were valued for their skill, they were needed for the atmosphere they created. They were rewarded, sometimes generously, for performances that pleased their patrons, and they were, simultaneously, regarded as socially suspect. The church periodically condemned performers as morally dubious, as people whose profession involved pretense, emotion, and the manipulation of an audience, all of which the church considered dangerously close to lying. Minstrels and jesters were occasionally denied the sacraments, refused burial in consecrated ground, or subjected to public moral censure by clergymen who were themselves performing a role for an audience every Sunday, but did not appear to notice the parallel. The condemnation did nothing to reduce demand. Every lord wanted musicians at his table. Every court wanted a jester. The church's disapproval and the aristocracy's appetite coexisted without either side showing any interest in resolving the contradiction. The sound of a harp under the murmur of conversation, the sudden, bright laugh at the jester's line, rippling outward from the high table and fading as it reaches the lower seats where people laughed a beat later because they heard the words, a beat later. The warmth of the room, the flicker of the fire on the faces of people who have been eating and drinking for 3 hours and are softening, loosening, settling into the deep, heavy comfort of a body that has been well fed and a mind that is beginning to let go of the day. The candles are shorter now. The rushes on the floor have been compressed by hundreds of feet and smell of lavender and spilled wine and warm earth. The music continues, softer now, a single harp playing something slow and repetitive and ancient, and the hall is drifting, gently, toward the end of the evening. But the evening is not quite over. There is still the question of what happens to everything that is left on the table. And the answer to that question reveals one last secret about the king's table, one that is less about food and more about the machinery of reputation, the economics of generosity, and the slow, quiet way that trying to keep up with a king's table could destroy everything a lesser man had built. The tables are being cleared. Servants move through the hall, gathering platters, stacking trenchers, carrying away the wreckage of a meal that fed hundreds and produced surplus enough to feed hundreds more. The subtleties are gone, eaten or crumbled into fragments that nobody will reassemble. The meat dishes are half empty, or entirely empty, depending on how far from the king they were placed. The bread, the sauces, the pottages, the pies, with their heavy, uneaten coffin crusts, all of it is being collected with a quiet efficiency that suggests this process is as rehearsed and as hierarchical as the meal that preceded it, because the leftovers are not waste. They are currency. The almoner, the household officer responsible for charitable distribution, moves through the aftermath with the practiced eye of a man who does this every night. he separates, he sorts, he directs. The best of the remaining food, the dishes that came from the high table and still carry the prestige of proximity to the king, are set aside. The rest is collected into baskets and parcels. Tomorrow morning, or sometimes that same evening, the surplus will be carried to the gates of the estate and distributed to the poor who gather there, knowing that the dole arrives on a schedule as reliable as the tides. This is the public face of the system. The Lord feeds the poor with the remnants of his table. The church approves. The chronicles record the generosity. The reputation grows. The cost, and this is the part that the reputation is designed to obscure, is almost nothing. The food has already been paid for. It has already been cooked, served, and partially consumed. It cannot be stored for another meal, because the preservation technology does not extend to leftover roasted peacock. Giving it away disposes of a surplus that would otherwise rot, and in exchange for that disposal, the Lord receives a reputation for Christian charity that would cost a fortune to build through any other means. Performative generosity, with surplus you cannot use anyway, is the medieval ancestor of every corporate donation of product approaching its expiration date, written off against taxes, and announced in a press release that emphasizes the company's commitment to the community. The structure is identical. The motive is identical. The cost to the giver is, in both cases, close to zero. But the system had layers beneath the public performance. The servants who worked the feast relied on the leftovers as an informal, unspoken supplement to their wages. The kitchen staff took what they could. The servers kept what they could carry. The hierarchy of scraps mirrored the hierarchy of the meal. The highest-ranking servants had first access to the best remainders. The lowest took what was left after everyone above them had taken their share. This was not theft. It was understood. It was tolerated. It was, in practice, part of the compensation structure of the household, a payment in food that never appeared in the household accounts because nobody chose to write it down. The cook, who spent 18 hours building the meal, ate the remains of it, standing in a kitchen that was already being cleaned for tomorrow. The almoners' baskets went out the gate. The poor received them. The Lord's name was spoken with gratitude by people who depended on that surplus and had no leverage to demand it. The system worked. It worked for the Lord, whose generosity cost him nothing he could have used. It worked for the church, which could point to the charity of the faithful. It worked for the servants, whose unofficial access to the leftovers made their wages survivable. It worked, in a limited and dependent way, for the poor, who ate better on the nights after a feast than on any other night of the week. The only thing it did not do was change anything. The poor remained poor. The Lord remained wealthy. The surplus remained a byproduct of excess, not an act of redistribution. And the reputation it purchased was worth more to the giver than the food was worth to the receiver. In some households, the trenchers and the scraps did not go to the poor at all. They went to the dogs. The choice was revealing in its indifference. Feeding the poor with your used bread was piety. Feeding the dogs with it was a statement that piety was not a priority tonight. Both options solved the same logistical problem. Both disposed of the same unusable surplus. The only difference was the audience and what you wanted them to think of you. And now, softly, we come to the part of the story that the feast was designed to make everyone forget. The part about what happens when you try to keep up with the king's table without the king's money. There is a name in the records, not a famous name, not a name that appears in chronicles or histories or the indexes of books about medieval England, a name that appears in household accounts, in land records, in the ordinary paperwork of a minor noble family managing an estate somewhere in the English countryside. The name appears in connection with feasts, generous feasts, feasts that drew visitors and impressed neighbors, and maintained the family's reputation as people of standing and hospitality. The feasts were ambitious, the provisions were expensive, the wine was imported, the spices were purchased at market prices, that reflected every markup between the Malabar coast and the English Midlands. The entertainers were hired, the household was dressed in its best, the tables were set with care, and the guests were fed with a liberality that suggested a fortune deeper than the one that actually existed. The debts appear in the records a few years later, small at first, borrowing against the next harvest to cover the costs of hospitality that the current harvest could not support, then larger, selling rights to future income to cover present expenses, then larger still. The estate begins to shrink, a parcel of land is sold, then another. The name that appeared in the records in connection with feasts begins to appear in connection with creditors, with legal disputes over debts owed, with transfers of property to men whose names appear nowhere in the guest lists of the feasts that created the debts in the first place. And then the name stops appearing at all. The records continue. Other names fill the spaces. The land passes to new owners. The estate is absorbed into a larger holding. The family that hosted the feasts, that maintained the generous table, that did what their social position required them to do, at a cost their income could not sustain, disappears from the documentary record with the quiet finality of a candle burning out in an empty room. The debts survived longer than the reputation. The reputation survived longer than the estate, and the estate survived longer than the family's ability to hold it. Convert the accumulated debts into labor, and the numbers carry a weight that is difficult to set down. Years, decades. Lifetimes of a carpenter's daily wage, consumed by the attempt to look wealthy for a few evenings a year. The king could afford his table because the kingdom paid for it. The minor noble could not afford his table because only his estate paid for it, and his estate was not a kingdom. The difference was structural, permanent, and invisible until it was too late, and by the time it became visible, the only thing left to see was the absence where a family used to be. The silence at the end of the record is the ruin, not a dramatic collapse, not a siege or a battle or a scandal, just a name that was there and then was not, and a set of debts that explain why, if you know how to read them. The king's table destroyed this family not through malice, but through example. The standard was set at the top. Everyone below it reached upward, and some of them reached further than their arms could extend and fell without anyone noticing until the paperwork was sorted years later. The hall is nearly empty now. The tables have been dismantled, the boards carried away, the trestles folded and stacked against the walls. The floor is a mess of crushed rushes, spilled wine, dropped crumbs, and the faint, greasy residue of a meal that fed hundreds. The fire has burned down to a deep, low bed of embers that gives off more warmth than light. And the room that was loud and bright and full of voices an hour ago is quiet in a way that stone rooms are quiet, with a stillness that feels permanent, even though you know the noise will return tomorrow. The kitchen is still working. It is always still working. The scullions are scrubbing the pots. The master cook is reviewing what needs to be ordered for tomorrow. The spit boy, who turned the meat for this evening, is asleep on his pallet by the hearth, curled against the warmth, his hands still smelling of smoke and rendered fat. He will wake before dawn and start again. He will do this for years. He may, if he is talented and fortunate and enduring, become the man who runs this kitchen. He may spend his entire career building food of extraordinary skill and complexity for tables he will never sit at, for people who will never know his name. The woman who ground the spices this afternoon is cleaning her mortar. The clerk of the spicery is locking the door to the spice room and checking the ledger one final time. The almoner is overseeing the last baskets of surplus as they are prepared for distribution in the morning. The credentiarius, the man who tasted every dish before the king touched it, is somewhere in the household, alive, which means today was a good day at work. These are the people of the king's table, not the king, not the courtiers, not the ambassadors who were impressed, or the rivals who were intimidated. The people who built the spectacle from raw ingredients and physical labor, who turned flour and fire and spice and animal into an experience that communicated power, who did this every day with skill that would be respected in any century, and who were, for the most part, invisible to the people they served. Their names do not appear in the histories. Their faces do not appear in the paintings. Their contribution is measured in the household accounts as an expense, listed between firewood and candle wax, and valued accordingly. They were not simpler than you. They were not less skilled. They were not less proud of their work, or less aware of its quality. They were just as clever, just as creative, just as capable of building something beautiful from difficult conditions, and just as invisible to the people who benefited most from what they made. The cook in any restaurant kitchen tonight, working a 12-hour shift for wages that do not reflect the skill the job requires, building plates of food that will be photographed by people who will never ask who made them, would recognize these medieval kitchen workers instantly, not as historical curiosities, as colleagues. So tonight, as you lie here, warm and comfortable, with clean water within reach, and food in the cupboard, and a softness beneath you that a medieval king would have envied, spare a quiet thought for them, the real ones, not the cartoon characters from the history books or the movie sets, the flesh and blood people who woke up early and worked late and built something extraordinary every single day for people who never once turned around to look at the kitchen door and wonder who was behind it. The fire is almost out now. The last ember is glowing a deep, soft red that pulses once, twice, and holds steady. The hall is dark. The rushes are still. The old secrets of the king's table are settling into the silence, folding themselves back into the centuries where they lived, carried by the people who kept them without ever knowing they were keeping anything worth remembering. Rest easy now. Let your breathing slow. Let the smoke drift, and the firelight fade, and the centuries close softly behind you. The table is cleared, the hall is quiet, and the long, warm night is yours.